So, the field of provable security lies at the intersection of cryptography and cybersecurity, where the goal is to eliminate avenues of attack against systems. And these days, like I just said, the standard of security for a cryptographic protocol is that breaking it should be as hard as solving some unsolved problem, like efficiently factoring the product of large prime numbers, or solving computing discrete logarithms in certain finite groups. Now, rooting security in complexity theory this way provides a strong guarantee, but in practice, the provable security methodology has some important limitations. And one of them is, for a given system, it succeeds only to the extent that the system's formal specification accurately captures its real-world behavior. So the subject of my dissertation is the task of reconciling discrepancies between the real system and its existing formal analysis. So let me start off with a couple motivating examples. Now, much of the cryptographic software that you and I use every day is based on schemes with security proof. And among them is the latest version of TLS, version 1.3. And for those who don't know, TLS is the de facto means of establishing a secure channel over the internet, so understanding its security is super important. In that spirit, an early draft of TLS 1.3 was based on a protocol called OPTLS, which itself has a security proof, and OPTLS was designed to meet the needs of the new standard. Even so, significant changes were made to OPTLS in the process of translating it into the draft. And this is typical, actually, of the standardization process. The protocol's original designers won't be able to foresee all of the practical considerations that the standard needs to address, so changes are often necessary. But this does raise an interesting question. What, if any, of the provable security that supported the original protocol is inherited by the standard? Now, a related problem is the task of properly accounting for key reuse. When we formalize a security experiment, we usually imagine that the secret keys that we generate are only used by the target application that we're interested in studying. Now, for this reason, it's usually seen as good cryptographic hygiene to enforce key separation. That is, to ensure that distinct applications use distinct keys. However, it's quite common in practice for keys to be reused among multiple applications. As a simple example, consider that a signing key used for authentication in TLS might also be used for other protocols. Certificate authorities allow this, and it has the advantage of reducing the number of keys that you ultimately need to deploy. But this has potential side effects for these applications, and these need to be addressed in the design of the underlying protocols, since key reuse can lead to cross-protocol attacks. Now, on their face, these problems might appear to be quite different, at least from a technical standpoint. What they have in common, though, is that they both involve practical aspects of the real system that are not addressed by the existing proof. And the reason that this gap exists is fairly straightforward. The tasks of designing provably secure cryptography and translating cryptography into practice, these tasks often require different skill sets and domain expertise. So we can't blame the designer for not anticipating every possible aspect of the real system, nor can we fault practitioners for making changes that potentially invalidate existing analysis. So I think the real question is, what could be done about this? So let's step back and think about a general version of this problem. We're starting with some reference system for which security is known, and we want to infer the security of the real system that's derived from it. The reference system here refers to the formal specification from the original analysis, and the real system is obtained by revising its specification in order to account for some observed behavior, like the details of a standard or key reuse in the deployment. Now, I'll refer to this process as translation. In general, translation refers to the revision of a scheme specification or its execution environment in order to account for discrepancies between the real system and the subject of the proof. And because translation can result in attacks, it's important to thoroughly evaluate its impact on security. So suppose that we have a security proof for a system Y. When we translate Y into a new system X, the hope is that X is at least as secure as Y. That is, the translation doesn't result in a new attack. And the way we would verify this is to repeat the same analysis for X as has already been performed for Y. That is, suppose that we know that breaking Y is as hard as solving some problem P. What we want to show is that this reduction from the hardness of P to the security of Y can be modified to account for the translation. But this task bears a significant analytical cost, and one that might make a rigorous treatment of translation prohibitive. Now, generating a fresh proof requires a certain amount of work, and depending on how different the real system is from the reference system, this task is likely to be highly redundant. So to take an analogy, imagine we want to find our way to the top of a mountain. We might choose to start from scratch, but if someone has already found a path to a point close to where we want to go, then we might save ourselves a good deal of trouble if we start our pathfinding expedition, from this previously discovered point. And so it is with provable security. The work required to prove that the real system is secure might significantly overlap with the work required to prove that the reference system is secure. Which leads me to the central thesis of my dissertation, which is that when evaluating the security impact of translation, that is, changes to a cryptographic scheme or its execution environment, it's possible to preserve the rigor of existing analysis without incurring the cost of a direct proof. To demonstrate this, what we're going to do is characterize the conditions under which it's possible to prove that the real system is secure by appealing directly to what's already been established for the reference system. In other words, what we want is a black box reduction from the security of Y to the security of X. Now, the main contribution of my dissertation is a formal framework in which this kind of argument can be made precise. In the remainder of my talk, I'll explain how it works and demonstrate a couple real-world examples. But before I jump in, let me quickly remind you of the objective I laid out last year during my proposal. Motivated by discrepancies between complex real-world protocols and their formal specifications, my goal was to articulate a set of design patterns for protocols that might make it easier to close this gap in the underlying theory. In particular, by the time I proposed, I had written a paper about how to design protocols in order to ease the task of accounting for key reuse among them. So my concrete objective was to generalize the analytical framework in that paper in order to account for some additional security issues related to protocol design. My dissertation fulfills this objective in the sense that the framework I'm about to present deals with the more general problem of secure translation. All told, my thesis is based on 3 of my published papers, but in this talk I'm only going to discuss the last 2. The first I'll discuss will appear at Crypto 2020 this summer, and the second paper I'll talk about I presented at Crypto last year. So, the centerpiece of this work is what I'll call its translation framework. So named because we're going to use it to reason about the security impact of translation. It's based on the notion of indifferentiability, which by now is a fairly well-known idea, particularly as a design goal for cryptographic hash functions. But the notion is much more general than this one application. And here I'm going to demonstrate for the first time its use for studying cryptographic protocols. Now, if you're unfamiliar with indifferentiability, don't worry, I'm going to define it in a little while. I'm going to drink some water first. All right. So I'm going to start this off by describing the case study that motivated this application of indifferentiability. One of my personal favorite types of protocols is password authenticated key exchange, or PAKE for short. Now the goal is to establish a symmetric key between a client and a server who initially only share a password. So here on the slide, I've drawn a PAKE protocol that has just 2 messages. This first sent from the client to the server, and the second sent from the server to the client. And after they've exchanged these messages, the server and client can derive a shared key, which we're going to call the session key. And the security goal is that the session key should be indistinguishable from a random key, even to an adversary who observes all network traffic and can actively interfere in the protocol's execution. This key indistinguishability property, as it's commonly known, it formalizes the intuition that an active network attacker should be unable to compute session keys computed by honest parties. And this should hold even when the password has low entropy. That is, when it's something that's easy for a human to remember rather than a strong cryptographic key. But if the password is so easy to remember that it's easy to guess, then there's no hope of achieving security at all, because the password can the adversary can always try to guess the password when impersonating one party to the other. If its guess is correct, then the victim will compute the same session key as the adversary, and so it can compute the session key. And because this is inevitable, PAKEs are designed to ensure that the adversary can't do any better than this online password guessing attack. However, some PAKEs are also designed to resist a much stronger attack. Rather than store the password in the clear, the server might instead operate on the image of the password under some one-way function. That way, if the adversary steals the image file, it still needs to do some work in order to crack the password and impersonate the client. But regardless of the precise security goal, PAKEs are wonderfully versatile objects that find a lot of useful applications. Now, they tend to be, on the simple side, often having just 2 messages. And simplicity is a real asset here because the lower the communication complexity, the easier it is to integrate the PAKE into higher level applications. In particular, there's been a lot of recent interest in integrating a PAKE into TLS. Now, this would allow using passwords alongside of or even in lieu of traditional certificates so that TLS can be used without solely relying on the web public key infrastructure for authentication. Okay, so how might we do this? How might we integrate a PAKE protocol into TLS? So here I've drawn a simplified view of the TLS 1.3 handshake. The client and server exchange 3 flows in this protocol before they derive a key. In the first flow, the client sends its Diffie-Hellman key share to the server. And in the second flow, the server sends its own key share to the client, as well as another value, which I'm going to call the server's confirmation message. And I denoted it server conf on the slide. And in the last flow, the client sends its own confirmation message, client conf, to the server. Now, each of these flows corresponds to a sequence of actual handshake messages in the TLS protocol. But as I'll talk about later, the contents and semantics of these messages aren't really relevant to the problem at hand. For our purposes, all that matters about them is that the key exchange messages are sent in the clear, whereas the confirmation messages depend on keys derived from the shared secret. Now, those who are familiar with TLS, who've worked with this protocol before, will notice that, well, there are any number of ways that we might integrate a PAKE into the handshake. But the general principle is that we would standardize a protocol extension for this purpose. Now, many extensions in TLS have the same basic structure. A client requests usage of the extension by sending an extension request to the server, and if the server agrees to use it, it'll send an extension response in reply. Now, the request in response might carry data that's relevant to the extension. In particular, we can specify an extension in which the request carries the first PAKE message and the response carries the second. Then we would use the PAKE's shared secret to derive keys rather than the usual Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Now, this isn't the only possible way to integrate a PAKE into TLS, but this approach does have some nice features. First, it works with any PAKE that has just 2 messages, and it has a relatively low implementation complexity. But what about security? The hope here is that at the very least, this usage of the PAKE is no less secure than the PAKE itself. Excuse me. In other words, whatever security property has been proven for the PAKE should also hold for the PAKE extension. So let me now dive into what is the intended security goal for this class of protocol. And here I'll describe the extended Kennedy cross-check model for authenticated key exchange. And I'm going to define it in terms of 2 core components. The execution environment, which formalizes the interaction of the adversary with honest parties, and the game, which will formalize the adversary's objective in attacking the protocol. Now, if you're familiar with the ECK model, or really any game-based model for authenticated key exchange, then the decoupling of the components of the security experiment might seem a bit unusual. But this is going to help us to get where we're eventually going, which is to use indifferentiability to reason about secure translation. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the ECK model, let me briefly explain it. So we imagine a set of clients and servers communicating over a network in which each party can send a message to every other party. We model an active network attacker by having the adversary be responsible for relaying all traffic in the network. And this means that it observes all messages transmitted between honest parties, It can modify these, drop them, reorder them, inject its own messages, and so on. And we'll let the adversary initialize and concurrently execute any number of sessions, that is, instances of a party running the protocol with an instance of some other party. So imagine a client session interacting with a server session in an execution of the protocol. This is, in the formal model, this is all handled by the adversary passing messages between sessions. Now, the attacker is empowered to corrupt a session by revealing its ephemeral key, which consists of the random coins consumed by that session, for example, to generate the party's key share. It can also corrupt a party by revealing its static key, that is, the long-term secret used by the party across multiple sessions. In our case, a client static key would be its password. When a session completes successfully, it outputs a session key, which the attacker is also capable of revealing. And remember that the goal of the adversary is to distinguish some session key from a random one. So to formalize this, the experiment defines an oracle that performs the following procedure. It flips a coin, and if the coin comes up heads, then it returns the key output by some test session chosen by the adversary. Otherwise, it chooses a key at random and returns that instead. Now, the adversary wins if it correctly guesses the outcome of the coin flip based on the key returned by the oracle. And that's how we formalize what the adversary learns about a particular session key. We're also going to require that the test session is fresh, in the sense that computing the real test session key should be non-trivial for the adversary to do. And generally speaking, whether a session is fresh depends on the particular protocol, as well as the values the adversary has corrupted. That is, which ephemeral keys, static keys, and session keys that it's learned so far. So that's basically the ECK model in a nutshell. What I've shown you here are the salient details of the model that are going to be relevant to our question. So we're going to write this experiment in terms of three objects: the adversary A, the game G that formalizes this key indistinguishability property, and the system that formalizes the execution environment. And the system is at the center of the action here. It specifies two interfaces, one that's called by the game and another that's called by the adversary. And the second interface lets the adversary interact with honest parties, including initializing new sessions, sending messages to sessions, and revealing ephemeral and static keys. The first interface is used by the game in order to obtain session keys, as well as other information used to determine if the test session is fresh. The adversary makes queries to the game in order to reveal session keys, including for the test session, and to make its guess of the challenge bit. Now, the experiment begins by, of course, running the adversary, and once it halts, the game outputs a bit indicating whether the adversary's attack was successful. What we're interested in is a protocol's concrete security. That is, the probability that an adversary with a given runtime and query complexity correctly guesses the challenge bit. Our goal for the design of our PAKE extension is that its concrete security should be roughly the same as the concrete security of the underlying PAKE. More formally, what we want to show is that for every adversary that breaks the PAKE extension with some probability, there exists an adversary B that breaks the PAKE itself with essentially the same probability and that has a similar runtime and query complexity. Now, it turns out that we can construct such a B whenever the execution of the PAKE extension is indifferentiable from the execution of the PAKE. So let me now clarify what this means. In particular, what I want to show you is how to use the standard notion of indifferentiability to reason about secure translation. And we're going to find that it has some important limitations that we'll need to overcome. Okay. The usual notion of indifferentiability is expressed in terms of an adversary D, which we'll call the differentiator, and a pair of systems X and Y. So as usual, we'll think of X as the real system and Y as the reference system for which security is known. Now, D is given black box access to one of these systems, and its task is to determine which it's interacting with. It outputs 1 if it believes it's interacting with the real system, and we're interested in the probability that it outputs 1 in this real experiment versus in the reference experiment. And this will formalize its advantage in discerning which system it's interacting with. Now, in the reference experiment, the adversary's access to the system's second interface is mediated by a simulator S. So the simulator's job is to trick the adversary into believing that it's interacting with the real system when in fact it's running in the reference experiment. So the system's second interface is meant to formalize what changes from the reference system to the real one. So going back to our model for authenticated key exchange, recall that the second interface lets the adversary execute sessions and reveal ephemeral static keys. So in this setting, the simulator's job is to make the execution of the base PAKE look like the execution of the PAKE extension. In general, we'll say that X is indifferentiable from Y if for every efficient D there exists an efficient S such that D's advantage in differentiating the real experiment from the reference experiment is small. In other words, to prove indifferentiability, what we want to do is construct S and so that D is unable to tell which experiment it finds itself in. Now, if we can do this, then we can transform an attack against the real system into an attack against the reference system. So let me briefly describe how this transformation works. We're given a real system attacker A and a simulator S, and we want to construct a reference system attacker B and a differentiator D such that in the real experiment, D outputs 1 whenever A wins, and in the reference experiment, D outputs 1 whenever B wins. And this will let us derive the bound that's shown in the bottom left of your screen. Now, D works by running the adversary A endgame G with its own interface oracles, as shown in the bottom right of your screen. Its output is the outcome of the experiment according to G. So by construction, in the real experiment, D outputs 1 precisely when A wins. So what's left for us to do is to construct B so that in the reference experiment, D returns 1 when B wins. So B works by running A, answering its queries using its own oracles, except that A's second interface queries are mediated by the simulator S, as they are in D's reference experiment. Now, the intuition here is that if the simulation provided by S looks like the real system, then B should succeed whenever A succeeds. And the intuition, this intuition is formalized by this lemma, which I'll call the composition lemma. And that's basically what indifferentiability buys us. It formalizes the conditions under which an attack against the real system can be transformed into an attack against the reference system. Now, if you don't quite see how the reduction works, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry too much. The thing that I want you to remember is that whenever X is indifferentiable from Y, then there's an efficient reduction from the security of Y to the security of X, in the sense formalized by game G. In other words, if X is indifferentiable from Y, breaking X is essentially as hard as breaking Y, which is excellent because now we have a way to infer the security of the real system from what's already established for the reference system. All we have to do is prove indifferentiability. However, this particular notion, which I'll remind you is the usual notion of indifferentiability, is not yet suitable for a formal treatment of secure translation. Indifferentiability is normally used to reason about fairly simple objects, like hash functions or block ciphers. The objects that we're interested in studying, authenticated key exchange, for example, are much more complex. And to deal with this complexity, we'll need to generalize the notion a bit further. For starters, our notion of indifferentiability pertains to a more general security experiment. So here's the experiment that we had before involving the same old system X, game G, and adversary A. In the translation framework, we're going to embellish this experiment in 3 ways. The first thing we'll do is we're going to add another object to the experiment called the resources. And this object will formalize things that might be used to prove security, but aren't essential to defining security. For example, resources are used to formalize the random oracle model in our experiment. Now remember that when we model a function as a random oracle, we replace each invocation of that function with a call to the random oracle, and we also give the adversary access to the random oracle as well. Now, resources can be used for a variety of things, but in general, we're going to think of them as objects in the experiment that the system and adversary share access to. Next, the experiment is parameterized by a function psi, which we'll call the transcript predicate. And this is going to determine if the adversary's attack is valid based on the sequence of queries it makes to the game and system. The adversary wins if the game outputs 1 as usual, and its attack is valid according to the transcript predicate. Now, this is going to be useful for enforcing restrictions on the execution environment when proving indifferentiability. For example, in an analysis of a particular authenticated key exchange protocol, we might need to restrict the adversary from revealing ephemeral keys. Now, the last generalization will help make our analysis of TLS easier. Now, TLS specifies a very complex protocol, and most of the details are irrelevant to what we want to prove. The partially specified protocol methodology of Rogaway and Steggers provides a nice way to account for these without needing to specify them exhaustively. So we're going to include their methodology in our framework. And the strategy is to divide a protocol specification into 2 components. The protocol core, which is meant to formalize the elements of the protocol that are essential to the security goal, and the specification details, which is meant to capture everything else. And the protocol core is defined in terms of calls to an oracle for the specification details, which in our security experiment is answered by the adversary. And that means that the adversary participates in the computation of the protocol. And this formalizes an unusually strong attack model, but one that yields a rigorous treatment of the standard itself and without exhaustively specifying all of its fine points. The idea is that a security proof in this model holds not only for a single protocol, but a large set of protocols where each corresponds to a different realization of the specification details. So in formalizing the TLS as a partially specified protocol, our job is to ensure that the real protocol is in this set. So let's now define a notion of indifferentiability that's suitable for this experiment. Remember that we're interested in an adversary's advantage in differentiating some real system X from some reference system Y. As usual, D's access to the second interface of Y is mediated by a simulator S. Likewise, D's access to the shared resources is also mediated by the simulator. And to emphasize this, in the bottom right corner of the slide, I've written the resources in the real experiment as R and in the reference experiment as Q. So the new definition is this. We'll say that X with shared resources R is psi indifferentiable from Y with shared resources Q if for every efficient differentiator D, there exists an efficient simulator S, such that D can't differentiate the real experiment from the reference experiment, except perhaps with small probability. Now, for this generalized notion, which we'll call shared resource indifferentiability, it's easy to prove an analog of the composition lemma that we had before, which says that if the real system X with R is psi indifferentiable from the reference system Y with Q, then breaking X with R is essentially as hard as breaking Y with Q, in the sense formalized by any game G and transcript predicate psi. So I've tried to make this as not abstract as I could, but I think there's still a lot of detail here that needs to be kind of digested. So let me just quickly summarize. The translation framework is basically a security model that allows us to express a wide range of security goals for a wide range of systems. And for this model, we've defined a generalized notion of indifferentiability, which we'll call shared resource indifferentiability, that suffices to show that a given translation is secure without resorting to a fresh proof. So in the remainder of my time, I'd like to demonstrate a couple case studies that should help make this kind of argument a bit more concrete, and hopefully also convince you that this methodology is useful. Now, I also need to say there's a lot more to the translation framework than I've shown here. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to check out our paper from Crypto 2020 if you'd like to see more. And I can also give you the link for the ePrint. All right, I'm gonna drink a little bit of coffee. All right. In my thesis, I considered two applications of the translation framework. The first is to the problem of secure protocol translation, where the real system is derived from the reference system by changing the protocol itself. And our case study of designing a PAKE extension for TLS is a nice example. What we're going to do concretely is show how to securely instantiate the extension shown on the right with a particular PAKE protocol. The PAKE we'll start with is the SPAKE2 protocol, first designed and analyzed by Abdallah and Pointcheval. Now, SPAKE2 is an exceptionally simple protocol. The client and server perform a standard Diffie-Hellman key exchange, except that their key shares are masked by multiplying them by distinct group elements M and N, each raised to the power of PW, which is the password encoded as an integer. On input of the server's password mask key share, the client first unmasks it, computes the shared secret, then hashes the password, the shared secret, and its transcript of its conversation with the server to get a session key K. And the server is going to do the same thing on its end. That way, if they've had a matching conversation, then they derive the same session key. All right. So we're going to make some minor changes to SPAKE2 in order to integrate it into TLS. The client and server will exchange password mask key shares and compute the shared secret in the usual way. However, the key derivation is going to work a little bit differently. Now in TLS, the parties derive not only the session key K, but also a pair of keys I'll call K1 and K0, which are used to compute the confirmation messages. Now, each of these keys is derived by a separate call to HKDF, which is the key derivation function used in TLS. We'll feed the same input into each call to HKDF as we did to the hash function in SPAKE2. That is this value IKM, which again encodes the password, the shared secret, and the PAKE transcript. Okay. The second change we're going to make is to the computation of the public parameters M and N, which are used to mask the key shares, remember. So the security of SPAKE2 relies heavily on M and N being generated securely during a trusted setup phase. And rather than have to rely on trusted setup, we're going to set M and N to be the output of some secure hash function that's suitable for the underlying group. That is a function that takes as input a string and outputs a group element. And this change was suggested on the IETF mailing list as a part of a discussion of if and how to standardize this protocol. So it's likely that this change would be required for standardization, and so I decided to adopt it in my analysis here. Now, as a result of these changes to key derivation, the public parameters, and not to mention all of the details of TLS, the security of this extension doesn't follow immediately from the security of SPAKE2 itself, since these are very much different protocols. However, what we can do is the following. We can prove that if SPAKE2 is secure in the random oracle model, then the TLS extension meets the same security goal in the random oracle model for HKDF and the hash to group function. And this is true regardless of the intended security goal, as long as it can be expressed as a game in our experiment. We'll only need to assume that the adversary doesn't reveal ephemeral keys, since this would lead to an attack against SPAKE2. What we want to prove is that the execution of the extension is indifferentiable from the execution of SPAKE2. Recall that for a given differentiator D, our goal is to construct a simulator S that tricks D into believing it's interacting with the extension, when in fact it's running in the reference experiment for SPAKE2. Now the central problem the simulator needs to solve is that D has direct access to the first interface of the system, which remember exposes information about the state that's used by the game to define security. That is freshness of sessions and session keys and so on. So S needs to use its own oracles in a way that provides D with a consistent view of the system state. And the basic idea, I'm waving my hands a lot here, is to embed an execution of the reference PAKE into each simulated session of the PAKE of the extension. That way, the embedded session computes a session key whenever the simulated session is supposed to have done so. So I'm waving my hands again, but this argument works The challenging part is simulating computations of the keys K1 and K0 without knowing the password or shared secret. And unfortunately, I don't have time to give the details, so I'll just say that our simulator might fail to provide a consistent view of the system state, which results in a modest loss in concrete security and requires us to make slightly stronger assumptions about the underlying group than were used in the original analysis of SPIG2. Now, I'm intentionally suppressing some of the details of the model, so again, I'll just encourage you to check out the paper if you want to learn more. Lastly, I'll just say that our analysis was, in our analysis, we formalized the PIC extension as a partially specified protocol. Again, meaning that the protocol is defined in terms of calls to the adversary. And this allowed us to rigorously handle all of the details of TLS without needing to specify them exhaustively. For instance, we leave the computation and verification of the confirmation messages completely up to the adversary. And I really wish I had time to explain how this works because it's kind of neat, but I don't. So let's now change gears and talk about the second application of the translation framework, water break. So the case study that we just saw is an instance of protocol translation, where again, the real system is derived from the reference system by changing the cryptographic scheme. A related problem is environment translation, which occurs when we leave the scheme as it is, but we change something about its execution environment. In particular, here we'll consider the problem of how to properly account for observed key reuse. And I'll begin this by describing an appropriate security model for this setting. We're interested in the security of a target application when its secret keys are used by other applications. So we'll start with the observation that it's often the case that there's a small set of secret key operations that all of these applications would have in common. In particular, let's suppose that the applications share access to an API, which defines the set of operations that can be performed with the secret key. As a concrete example, you might think of a hardware security module that stores a server's signing key for use in TLS. Our security model consists of the usual core components, a system, a game, and an adversary. Now, the system formalizes the execution environment of the API. And since we're interested in the security of some target application, this, along with the application security goal, will be formalized by the game. As usual, the experiment begins by running the adversary, and once the adversary halts, the game outputs a bit that indicates whether the attack was successful. Also, as usual, the game makes calls to the system's second interface and the game to the system's first interface. And this setting it up this way is going to allow us to use indifferentiability. Now, the reference system formalizes the usual setting in which the API is only called by the target application, that is, the game in our formal model. And the second interface only allows the adversary access to the API's public key. So in the real environment, what we want to do is account for any cross-protocol attacks that might result from key reuse. We'll capture these attacks quite conservatively by giving the adversary direct access to the API. This way, computations performed in other applications are formalized by the adversary's interaction with this interface. So I'll call this an exposed API attack against the target application. Now, generally speaking, an exposed API attack is extremely powerful. Imagine, for example, that the target application is TLS and the API exposes the server's signing key. If the adversary has unfettered access to this API, then it can easily impersonate the server because it can sign any message it wants on its behalf. Of course, in practice, this isn't very realistic. An exposed API attack, remember, is meant to formalize how the other applications use the secret key. But we'll usually know something about these applications that means that these kinds of trivial attacks aren't feasible. In particular, suppose that we know that the set of API calls made by the target application is disjoint from the set of API calls made by all other applications. Formally, we'll suppose that there's a set C that partitions the set of API queries made by the game from those made by the adversary. Now, this kind of partitioning is possible for TLS because each call to the signing API encodes a context string that binds a signature to the protocol. The idea is that as long as no other application uses the same context string, then no signature produced in those other applications will be deemed valid in the context of TLS. So the research question here is, if we assume in the security model that the API calls made by the adversary and the game are disjoint, can we prove security under exposed API attack? Well, the answer depends, of course, on the particular API, which is where the translation framework comes in. So here we have our two experiments used for defining shared resource indifferentiability. The real experiment on the left captures the adversary's capabilities in mounting an exposed API attack. In the reference experiment, the adversary no longer has this capability, but its access to the second interface, as well as the shared resources, is mediated by simulator S. So in this setting, S's job is to simulate secret key operations using only the public key. So for a given set C, we say that an API is C separable if the real environment for the API is psi indifferentiable from the reference environment, where the transcript predicate psi ensures that no API queries made to the first interface, well, I should say, okay, psi ensures that the API queries made to the first interface are all in C, and those made to the second interface are all not in C. We call an API context separable if it is C separable for some set C. And by the way, we'll require that the set is efficiently computable. Now, whenever this condition holds, we can prove that a target application that's secure in the usual setting is also secure under exposed API attack. And the proof is similar to the composition lemma that we showed for protocol translation. In fact, it significantly overlaps with it, but the details vary slightly. All right, in the few minutes I have left, I'd like to demonstrate how context separability is used. So let me quickly go through one of the case studies I considered in my dissertation. A variety of authenticated key exchange protocols have in common the following core operation, which I'm going to call DH then HKDF. In these protocols, the public key of each authenticated party is a point in a finite cyclic group, and their secret is that point's discrete logarithm. So a party's public key is G to the SK, where G is the group generator and SK is the party secret key. Now the API takes as input an arbitrary group element X and computes the Diffie-Hellman shared secret between X and the API's public key, that is X to the SK. And then it derives a symmetric key and outputs it. Now, HKDF is a particularly common choice for key derivation function here, hence the name DH then HKDF. Now, along with the shared secret, this function takes as input a salt string and an information string, the semantics of which will vary from a protocol to protocol. Now, we can prove this API is context separable when we model HKDF as a random oracle. For the proof to work, it's critical that the set of API queries made by the first and second interface are disjoint. In particular, our proof assumes that the target application always uses a distinguished information string for each evaluation of HKDF, and that no other application makes API queries with the same value. In fact, this is precisely how the information string is used in a variety of protocols, to uniquely identify the context in which the secret key is used. With that, let me wrap this sucker up. The provable security methodology has profoundly shaped the practice of cryptography, so much so that a proof is often a prerequisite to standardization, implementation, and deployment of cryptographic protocols. Yet, these very same forces can create discrepancies between the real system and its formal specification that result in a gap between what's known about the system and its real-world security. The translation framework allows a rigorous treatment of these discrepancies without incurring the analytical cost of a fresh proof. In particular, to show that a translation is secure, it suffices to prove that the real system is shared resource indifferentiable from the reference system. And we saw two applications of this idea. The first to the problem of protocol translation, where the real system is derived from the reference system by modifying the cryptographic scheme. As a case study, we considered the task of standardizing a TLS extension for SPIG2. The second application was to reasoning about the changes to the scheme's environment, in particular, to prove security in the presence of key reuse formalized in our setting as an exposed API attack. Now, taken together, these applications represent only a small fraction of the discrepancies that might arise between a crypto system and the security proof that supports it. Moreover, real-world cryptography is subject to continual change, and so the task of ensuring that its security rests on firm formal foundations remains an ongoing challenge. So it's my hope that this work will help guide this process going forward. That's it. Thank you very much. I'm ready for questions.